Welcome everyone to the American Civil War Museum and our Homefront Education Series. My name is Joseph and I am joined by Stephanie Arduini, the Deputy Director of the American Civil War Museum. And we are here to walk through the war with you. And so we have now entered into the second half of our 1862 videos, and we're really thinking about the struggle for freedom itself. We already talked about the contraband decision, of course, and how enslaved people were making those real big choices and going and seizing freedom with their own hands, putting themselves in these situations which would have otherwise been dangerous. And of course, it's not just happening in Virginia. I'm sure it's happening wherever the U.S. Army's going, right?
Absolutely, because emancipation was not a single event. It was a process. It was a struggle. And the contraband decision, as you mentioned, that sets this precedent that wherever the United States Army goes, you see swells and swells of emancipation events. So if it's a single person, or if it's an entire family, or if they somehow take control of a city or an area, then especially after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect in 1863, but still before, freedom can come to those places.
Right. After all, there are many generals who were inspired by General Butler's actual contraband decision and who make their own statements which effectively try to change the course of the war. Lincoln himself has to say, that's not what we're here, that's not what we're doing. But enslaved people still know that this is their best chance. And so they're still coming out in large numbers, following armies, going to places where they can, and really standing up for themselves in ways that hadn't been seen since, well, the days after the American Revolution.
And I think that's an important point, is that to me, it helps me understand just how deeply terrible the institution of slavery was. That removal of choice and control over your own lives and the violence and terror that it inflicted on people. Because when people seized their freedom for themselves and found their ways to the U.S. Army and set up these effective refugee or contraband camps, as they were called, that didn't mean that they were free and everything was fine. It meant they weren't enslaved. It didn't define what freedom meant. And so they were still struggling to find food, to find shelter, to find some way to make some money so they could buy the supplies. And that situation varied depending on where they were and who was in charge of those areas, how much care and protection those communities were able to get or not. But still, the fact that that uncertainty was better than slavery is huge.
Absolutely, because there are many stories of those types of folks really just showing up in these places and then dying. Right? It's not a happy event for many people. There are a large number that are actually subjected to difficult conditions, and yet it is still that powerful motivator. That struggle for freedom is that such a powerful motivator to get them to those places. And of course, it has a personal touchstone for my own family as well, but it is incredible that those kinds of things are happening. And now, when we bring back the government aspect into it, with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's decision to put this document out there and effectively change the war goals, it still doesn't have exactly the effect that all people would like to see. Folks like Frederick Douglass have some issues with it, but it still does something. It's good. But what are some of those shortcomings that we're talking about?
Yeah, so it frees enslaved people in all places in rebellion. So places like Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, that was under U.S. control already, so enslaved people there, they weren't covered. So places in the Confederacy that were still openly fighting and not under U.S. control, it covered that. It did not cover enslaved people in border states, because Lincoln's a politician. He's trying to issue something that's going to keep this fragile coalition of people together, because the United States is still deeply divided within northern and western states about support for the war. So he's walking a fine line. How can he issue this proclamation? Because he personally believes it's the right thing to do, but especially because he's a politician trying to work the system and win a war. And undermining the institution of slavery undermines the ability of the Confederacy to wage the war. So it doesn't blanket free all enslaved people. It frees some in a way that he feels like he can justify. And Lincoln himself wasn't even sure that he had the constitutional authority to do this. So he was really, really tiptoeing around this. But in it, as you mentioned, it does also establish some really, really important things.
Yeah, for one, it's saying that all those people in the spaces and states that are still in rebellion are now free. That's great. And now all they have to do is actually get to the freedom
And
that they've been told and
enforce
enforce it. Yes, but it also does one other really big and important thing as well, and that's with the actual enlistment of African Americans as soldiers. So we do see now those people who are kind of standing on the sidelines in many ways, especially in some of the northern states where you have African American men who are able-bodied and capable of fighting, who are saying, maybe I would, and if this was something a little bit more what I'm looking for, to use a phrase, they would as well. And as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, they do. Even in areas in the southern states. For example, down in New Orleans, where the Louisiana Home Guard had actually organized itself to fight, initially to protect the city of New Orleans, almost ready to fight for the Confederacy, who rejected them, and then they end up reorganizing and now fighting for the United States for a cause that they actually believe in. And so it's fascinating to see all those things too.
Absolutely. And I think what's powerful is that, you have people like Frederick Douglass who've been advocating, if you want to undermine the ability of the Confederacy, take away their labor force and give them a gun to put them out on the battlefield. It's kind of a 2-for-1, removing labor for the Confederacy and adding to your fighting force on the battlefield. So advocacy of African Americans to help turn opinions, especially of Abraham Lincoln, is also crucial in this. But of the about 200,000 Black men that we estimate to have fought for the United States military, about 180 of them fought in the Army, and half of that 200,000 we estimate to have been born into slavery. This is amazing to think about, leaving one violent and scary system to put your lives on the line in another violent, scary situation. It again underlines, for me at least, how important the idea of emancipation was to end the institution of slavery. But that doesn't go over well with everybody when now emancipation is also a main war aim of the war, which is not necessarily what everybody in the United States signed up for.
Right, absolutely. And of course, as we actually move into 1863, we're going to see that not everybody is happy with that, and sometimes that has violent results.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully you'll join us again for 1863 and we can talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely.